My name is Eugene Franck, and I'm called Gene, or in some cases, Spiderman, for those that knew me when I flew in the military. And I want to explain why I'm here. Back in February of 2014, I received the Vietnam Helicopter Pilot Association Aviator magazine. And as always, I read it from the first page to the last page. And in doing so, I came across a section in the magazine that's called Looking For. And it's a section in the magazine designed to have people write in letters, and they can look for old friends, friends of brothers, friends of sons, find out information about them. Well, I came across the one that said, Looking for Spider-Man. I'm going to read it to you. On 17 November 1969, Fire Support Base Fuller came under attack by a substantial force of NVA. The attack started with a perimeter receiving approximately 40 to 50 RPGs, followed by a ground attack. But by using both indirect and direct defensive fire, the wire is never breached. The RPGs, however, did injure 2 officers and 1 enlisted man. One of the officers was injured when he was hit in the head with several pieces of shrapnel after his helmet fell off while he was attempting to make contact with a cut-off howitzer gun crew. 2 medics were finally able to stop the bleeding, but they called for a medevac to take all 3 men off the mountaintop. Heavy fog prevented them from attempting the pickup. Finally, Spiderman, a pilot from a local transportation unit, put his life on the line to pick up the wounded. Lieutenant Dennis Booty, who was in charge of the Fire Direction Center during the evening shift on Fire Support Base Fuller, stood on the side of that cloud-covered hill and provided directions to the aircraft, thereby allowing him to find the pad and load up the wounded. Is there anyone out there who would help us, either myself, Clyde Lewandowski, or Dennis Booty, get in touch with this courageous man? Well, I read that, and I knew that was me. I remembered the event, and I made contact with Dennis and Clyde. And that's how I got in touch with the 6th of the 33rd Artillery. And over the last now 8, almost 9 years, got to know many of them, including Bob Reilly, who asked me to make this video. So in doing that, he's asked me to give my background and Army career so I can explain how I came to handle that particular event. Well, I was born in Berkeley, California. Grew up in Albany my entire life, and I played sports. I was on the swim team captain for a couple of years, played trumpet in the band, senior class president, had a great school group of friends. And in the 9th grade, we had to do a report and write an oral report, both, on what we wanted to be when we grew up. And I said I wanted to be a pilot. And that probably came from having my mom's brother was an Air Force B-29 pilot in World War II out in the Pacific. My dad's brother was a B-24 pilot in World War II. And my dad was an electronics inspector on a B-17s. So I'd had that kind of a background, and flying had always fascinated me. Took my first flight from California to New York and back on a Constellation, old tri-tail prop-driven airplane, and I came home on a DC-8, and I thought that was pretty cool, and I could see myself doing that for the rest of my life. Well, in pursuit of that, I went to San Jose State and it majored in aeronautical operations. Joined Air Force ROTC and fully expected to graduate from San Jose State and go in the Air Force. I'd passed all the Air Force qualification tests to do that. And at the end of my sophomore year, I even had to pass the physical to be accepted into the flight program. But it was determined that I wasn't going to graduate in 4 years. It was going to take me 5 years. So the Air Force ROTC requested that I skip 1 year of ROTC and do the final 2 years in what would be my junior and senior year in school. And upon graduation, I would be made a second lieutenant and go off to Air Force flight training. Well, in that first semester, I was taking 12 units. And without thinking too much about it, I dropped one of the classes and dropped down to 9 units. Well, back then with the draft, if you weren't a full-time student, you didn't get a student deferment. In less than a month of dropping that class, I had a letter from the Berkeley draft board stating that I was to show up on April the 10th and take my physical for induction into the military. Well, when I went home for Christmas that year, I went to the board and spoke to them, made them to try to see if I couldn't get out of being drafted by declaring that I was an ROTC student and was going to go into the Air Force, and they were going to could better utilize me in that capacity and then draft me as a private in the Army. Well, Berkeley Draft Board, which had a difficult time in meeting their quota, stated that because I had not signed an ROTC contract as of that date, I wasn't, as far as they were concerned, in ROTC and therefore a part-time student and eligible for the draft. So my fraternity brother and I, who had had a similar experience, decided we better go down and check out the recruiters and see what our options would be. Well, nobody wanted to take me to be a pilot, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Only the Army would offer me a flight training program if I were to join up. And my buddy decided he was going to go in the Army and he was going to go into OCS and he wanted to be an artillery officer. That was Tim Gabbard, great friend. So I signed up to go into the Army as RA, unassigned, which meant that when I got to boot camp at Fort Polk on April 10th, that I had to take tests to qualify for OCS. And I also had to take a test to qualify for aviation by passing the flight aptitude test. And they administered those tests to all that were interested in the first week that you're there prior to actually starting basic training. And Tim and I both passed the OCS test. I passed the OCS test, then passed the flight test, and then was told that I was going to have to take a physical and pass that. And if I passed that, that I would be going off to flight school. Sure enough, after 8 weeks of basic training, on graduation day, I was supposed to leave for Fort Walters, Texas, and start flight training. And I did. But when I got there, there's a huge backlog of candidates waiting to get into one of the flight classes. So they immediately sent me home. After 9 weeks in the military, I got to go home on leave for a week, came back. And then I was in what they call snowbird status. I had no training, but we would get assigned jobs to do around the post every day. My 21st birthday came up when I was in the snowbird status, and I went home again. So here I'd been in the Army about 12 weeks, and I've already had 2 weeks of leave. And when I returned, I finally got into a flight class that started in August of 1967. And so that started my flight training. The interesting thing about flight training is that it lasts for approximately a year, but you go through 20 weeks of training, 4 weeks of what's called pre-flight training, where you just take academic classes and military bearing type classes. After that 4 weeks, you start flight training, and you get 16 weeks of flight training. And in that phase, I was training in OH-23s, which was fairly familiar to most artillery units because it had a rounded bubble cockpit and a covered Hiller. It was a Hiller airplane, covered tail boom. And they used it a lot in artillery for forward observation kind of assignments, even in Vietnam. So at 10 hours, I soloed, one of the first to solo my class, and got thrown in the Holiday Inn swimming pool for that escapade. And then after about 110 hours of flight training at Fort Walters, we graduated, and I became a super senior. And for the next 3 weeks, I was an assistant TAC officer for a new class that was down in pre-flight at that time. Before I left with my roommate, and we drove another candidate's car across from Texas, Fort Walters, Texas, back to Savannah, Georgia. We were going to Hunter Army Airfield. Fort Rucker was the standard aviation training base at the time, and still is. I never got to Fort Rucker until I went to a reunion there about 10 years ago. But anyway, we were at Savannah, Georgia. Great place, nice town, good beaches. And there I took instrument training for 50 hours. We had a couple of weeks of 4 weeks, I believe it was, of transition training into Hueys, although we flew Hueys for instrument training. So by the time we got to transition training, we were pretty familiar with the aircraft. And it turned out to be a very valuable experience because it gave me additional hours in flying the helicopter. Eventually, I would fly in Vietnam. So completion of the transition training in flight school, you go to the advanced training. It's the field work kind of training where we do everything from night missions to formation flying. It's the field training exercises, waking you up in the middle of the night when they pretend you're under attack and having to get the aircraft into the air, moving troops around. We went through escape and evasion. And the completion of all of that training was made a warrant officer on one day, and then the very next day you get your wings, because you have to be a warrant officer to be a pilot in the Army, and became an Army aviator. Typically, the graduates from flight school would get a short leave up to 30 days, and then would get sent to Vietnam, where they would join a unit and start the process of flying as a co-pilot, becoming an aircraft commander, possibly going in the gunship platoon, that type of thing. Surprisingly, I got orders to go to Fort Carson, Colorado with There was 5 of us out of my flight class. Couldn't figure out why, but all I knew is I wasn't going to Vietnam. I was going to Fort Carson, Colorado. We all thought that was a good thing. Some of my buddies were a little jealous. Took us a while to figure out why and the people that were going, but it turns out that if you were a second tour Vietnam and it hadn't been 18 months, you didn't have to go back to Vietnam for 18 months. So my roommate, Louis Molinar, had been in the field as a radio telephone operator when he got his orders to go to flight school. Hadn't been 18 months yet. He'd only been back for a little over a year. So he got orders to go to Fort Carson. Ted Wicks, the other roommate of mine at Fort Carson, his dad was a CW4 in charge of all the supply and was in Vietnam and wasn't going to leave Vietnam until he was at his retirement. So Ted didn't have to go because his dad was there. They didn't want to send his dad back from Vietnam back to the United States. So we kind of figured it out. I had graduated high in my class. I didn't get to go to the Chinook school or Cobra school. And I think my reward for being on the battalion staff and graduating high in placement was I got to go to Fort Carson. So off to Fort Carson we go. I checked into Fort Carson and around July 4th after graduating on the 17th of June, because I didn't have as much leave time as everybody else. And got an apartment with Ted Wicks and Luis Molinar and started to go to Fort Carson. We weren't sure. We were hearing rumors that we were going to form a new unit, but in the meantime, they got us checked out to fly, and we did some flying around Fort Carson in Colorado. And I can remember taking a pay officer up to Denver to pay the guys that were up at the hospital in Denver. Did some search and rescue around the Rockies. Great place to fly and experience. But you have to remember, they kept sending more people there. And pretty soon we knew we'd heard rumors that we're going to become a new aviation battalion and we're going to join the 101st. So that got us a little concerned because we started looking and seeing, where's the 101st Vietnam? Oh, they're up by Way. They're right up by the DMZ. Northern I Corps. 1968, built very high activity year in Vietnam, and there was lots going on in that area. So here's the thing that you have to think about. There's 42 pilots assigned to an aviation company. We had 2 companies at Fort Carson, and we had 2 companies in Kansas, Fort Reilly, Kansas. A and B company was at Carson. C and D companies were in Kansas. We have all these young warrant officers. Most of us just graduated from flight school. We had first lieutenants, the captains that had just graduated from flight school. And we're going to Vietnam, and we had an attitude of, what are they going to do to us? Send us to Nam? Kind of lots of parties. Got in trouble many times at the officers club for being a little loud and disorderly, but a great time. Formed some really bonded with the guys that were in my company. I was assigned to A company, finally got a designation. We were A company, 158th Assault Helicopter Battalion. Our commanding officer was Major Maurice Doherty. Greatest commander I ever served under. He was a first cav, first tour experienced pilot. He looked at all us young warrant officers and said, they're all kids. We were. Some of us were 18, 19 years old. My roommate, Louis, was one of the older at 25. Ted Wicks was 19. I was 22 that July. So he started training us and teaching us how we were going to have to fly when we got to Vietnam, the way the first Cav flew in Vietnam. And we got about 140 hours of extra flying time, and that while we're there, most of it was tactical flying, learning how to fly, formation flying, how to land, other than the slow approach that teach in flight school, but how to land, and accelerating all the way to the ground and then slowing down at the last minute to just get less exposure to enemy fire. And on January 30th was when we were supposed to ship out, right after Christmas and New Year's. Well, during that experience, while we were in Fort Carson, my roommate, I was tall and thin. Ted is about 5'6", 7, 8. He'll probably say he's taller than that. And typical roommates, we'd be arguing over something. We'd start wrestling. And Ted one time commented about, I had these long arms and legs like a spider. He started calling me Spiderman. Ted was the kind of guy that you have as a roommate that avoided at all costs doing his share of cleanup, etc. So he was nicknamed the Weasel. And then Lou, who was older, very suave, debonair kind of guy, we called him the Dude for his way with the ladies. That started a call sign within our company. Pretty soon we were giving other people in the company call signs. So when we talked on the radio, we would call each other up and call, I'd say, Weasel, this is Spiderman, where are you, etc. And so after Fort Carson, almost everybody had call signs. They were never something you would pick. They were always assigned and given by others. And so sometimes, the one we nicknamed the Nerd, it wasn't something that he necessarily wanted, but didn't matter. That's what you got, whatever your handle became. Major Doherty, we always called the Major D. He showed up on a field training exercise in a heavyweight flight jacket, which includes a fur collar. We took one look at him and called him Nanook of the North. And Nanook became his call sign after that. My platoon leader was a great big rough Texan, carried a Bowie knife that was bigger than anything I'd seen in my life. He became the Bear. And that's how you got a call sign, and they stuck with you. Hard to change once you'd been given one. And hence the nickname Spider-Man that the 6th of the 33rd came to know me as. So on January 31st, the first contingent left for Vietnam. I was in the first contingent. Second contingent of our company left on February 1st, which most of you who have been to Vietnam know as Tet. We were supposed to fly out of Fort Carson, Colorado, to Alaska, to Japan, and then into Vietnam. Well, Air Force had autopilot problems, so we spent the night in Alaska. But we didn't care, because every day once we left continental US counted as a day in Vietnam. So the first day they should have been in Vietnam, we spent in Alaska in the officers club at Fort Richardson, Alaska. Next day we were in Japan, Yokota, Japan, and then they flew us into Da Nang. That's where we actually landed on Tet, and there was a guy out on the ramp and he was freezing. And we had come from Fort Carson, Colorado with winter. We were carrying our flight jackets and thinking it was hot. I thought, God, I can't believe this guy thinks this is cold. A year later, I know exactly how that man felt. We spent the night. They flew us up to Da Nang, from Da Nang to Phu, and the next day they took us in Chinooks up to Camp Evans, which was an old first Cav, Marine first, then first Cav, and then Army 101st Airborne base camp that housed the 3rd Brigade of the 101st Airborne. And on that Chinook flight up to that base camp, I look up in the cockpit, and there's one of my old classmates from Fort Walters days. It's the co-pilot on the Chinook, and he looks at me and is like, "What are you doing just getting here?" Because he'd been in Vietnam now for approximately 8 months. He's starting to think he's a short timer, and here one of his classmates shows up on his 2nd day in Vietnam, and is just starting. But we got to our base camp, and for the next 2 weeks, we were assigned we had no aircraft at this point. They came over on a flatbed truck that we flew out from Fort Carson to Sharp Army Depot in Stockton, and then they got wrapped in plastic and got put on a flatbed carrier, and they got taken to Vietnam on that flatbed carrier. In fact, Lou Molinar, my roommate, was one of the escort officers on that flatbed. Turned out he knew that a couple of weeks of the crossing all counted on his time in country. That's why he volunteered for it. Make his time in Vietnam shorter. But anyway, we didn't have aircraft, so we spent the next couple of weeks doing nothing but filling sandbags, getting our 16 by 32 foot hooches that the Navy Seabees made for us, and or repaired from what was left from the first Cav, and just kind of trying to get our quarters arranged. Funny story, when we went down to finally get our aircraft and flying back up to our home base, they had all of our aircraft sitting in the Da Nang Navy lumber yard. And they used the lumber in the lumber yard to protect the aircraft while they were sitting out there, and while they had to get the aircraft prepared to fly. So we finally got the word to come down and get the aircraft. We all went down, flew down there, got the aircraft in the morning, and turns out it was about noon. And we're surrounded by 2x4s, pieces of plywood, mahogany plywood, lumber that we knew if we had it available to us, we could make our hooches much more comfortable, divide them off, build box closets, keep our clothes in, desks, you name it. So we started asking around and found out that the Navy all went to lunch around noontime. So we stalled and are taking off when all the Navy people left the lumberyard. We filled 20 helicopters with as much wood, plywood, anything that looked like we could use it. And when we took off, we were loaded from the floor to the ceiling with wood hanging out the sides of the aircraft, you name it. I'm sure the Navy looked up and saw what we did and just shook their head, and I'm sure they didn't appreciate it, but when we got back to the company area, it made our living a lot more comfortable. And we started, that was our start of our scrounging. Guys found scrounged beds with mattresses instead of cots. And after a fairly short time in country, we had a pretty nice hooch. We had a little bar area in there. We had 8 of us, 8 warrant officers in a hooch, 6 commissioned officers in a hooch for all the pilots. Enlisted men, I think, had 16 in a hooch. One of the things that happened was Ted Wicks. Remember I said Ted, his dad was his head of supplies in Saigon. Well, Ted goes down and visits his dad to go to his dad's retirement party. And asked Ted, what do you guys need? Ted says, we need everything. We don't have anything. We got a 10 kW generator that runs the operations and the CO's hooch. We don't have lights. We have nothing. Well, Ted's dad sends him back home after his retirement party in an Air Force plane that's loaded with a 100 kW generator, air conditioner for Ted, room, all kinds of supplies. We made an agreement with the battalion that we'd hook them up onto our 100 kW generator so the battalion CO wouldn't make us give it back. I don't think any of it was ever on the records for the company, but it's Vietnam, and you learn to do what you can. In fact, one time I had a flying for the Seabees who was leaving Camp Evans after they completed building all the hooches for the battalion that was our 158th Assault Helicopter Battalion. All companies, A, B, C, and D, were all stationed at Camp Evans. And we shared a mess hall with C Company. B and D companies shared a mess hall and were across the flight line from us. But the Seabees had all kinds of supplies, and they had me sling loading that supplies and dumping it in the ocean. Well, I couldn't see wasting all that, so I'd pick up the sling load and I would fly around to the other side of the base camp where they couldn't see me. We'd go through what was in that netting and pull out sinks and God knows what. And then we would go out and dump the sling load in the ocean, and we'd come back and drop off the things we wanted, and we'd go back over to the CB pad to pick up another sling load of stuff, and repeated this until the commander of the CB saw what we were doing and decided that he didn't want us taking anything that and he buried it. He took a bulldozer and dug a great big hole and buried it. God knows what went in that hole, but that's what he ended up doing. But that was the way we found, we built our company area. It was scrounging. That's why I think it's kind of important to us. But after a couple of weeks, they decided they need to get all of us some training. So they would send about 10 of us down at a time to Camp Eagle to fly with our sister companies. In that case, my sister company was a company of the 101st Aviation Battalion at Camp Eagle, the Comancheros. So I went down to Camp Eagle with the Comancheros, and I got checked out, got my in-country check ride. I'm kind of walking around the company area right outside an operations tent, and this guy comes running out, Chief Warrant Officer. He's on his second year in Vietnam. he says, "Are you checked out?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Come with me. I need a co-pilot. Grab your stuff." So I grab my helmet and my chest protector, and I run down to the aircraft with him. And we take off and we go over to a pad, and they throw a bunch of ammunition in the back of the aircraft. We fly out kind of towards the Ashaw Valley along the Songbo River. And we're going to have to emergency resupply ammunition to an infantry unit that was in a battle with NVA at the time. We're hovering, he's hovering above the trees, and he's explaining to me how he hovers and holds the aircraft steady in a high hover while they're throwing the ammunition out the side of the aircraft. I'm seeing green tracers flying by us. And this guy was as calm and cool and collected as could be. And I'm thinking, this is my first flight in my second hour in Vietnam, and I'm getting shot at like this. I'm probably not going to live through a whole year. So right then and there, I decided I better learn as much as I can and be as professional and as I can to give myself the best chances that I can last a whole year. Well, after 14 hours flying with the Comancheros, I went back to Camp Evans, and another group of pilots came down to get their time in country. And so about March of '69, I started flying combat missions. First mission as a company was opening up fire support base Vagel. And Vagel was out near the Ashaw Valley. And as we were making the assault onto Vagel, it turns out that MDA were in the old foxhole. It was an old fire base. They were in the foxhole shooting straight up at us. One of our crew chiefs got shot in the head and killed. And it was a eye-opening experience because it became real fast. It became real when we lost Thomas Hackard. They had to take him, he had a head wound. They had to take him out to the hospital ship. We had 2 hospital ships that took turns on up by us in the north and down south that were off the coast, the repose and the sanctuary. Any head wounds, you flew them out directly to the one of the hospital ships because they had the emergency rooms on those ships to perform that operation. So that was our first combat assault. The second, in April, we did a combat assault into what became known as Fire Support Base Airborne. The lead aircraft was my company commander, Major Doherty, and Captain David Watson was my platoon leader, was his co-pilot. Well, flight of 10, I was at the back. The first aircraft got shot down and blocked the LC. Major Doherty was wounded. Aircraft crashed. Captain Watson got out of the aircraft to come around and try to get Major Doherty out. He took an RPG right in the chest and killed, along with the radio telephone operator that was with the infantry unit platoon leader that we were inserting that day. And the whole combat assault went to hell. One of the reasons we still blame was that we only got a 15-minute artillery bombardment of that LC. They had to use artillery for another encounter that was going on. And so after only 15 minutes, much to my company commander's disappointment, he was told to go ahead and do the combat assault into that LC. And it turned out to be extremely hot LC. When we finally were organized the next aircraft got in and got out, but we lost 2 more aircraft in that LC. And a lot of my friends were on the ground wounded. We couldn't get any more into the LC because the aircraft were blocking it. Turns out we were landing on a NVA field hospital and battalion headquarters. There was probably 1,000 men down there shooting at us. And that is why we're taking so much fire. Then the next day, we ended up with having to have a bunch of crews spend the night in that LC. They used the helicopter M60 machine guns for the perimeter, and they held them off. And Lieutenant Baccia kept all those guys alive. The next day, we had a second assault that we're going to do into another LC. And one of the aircraft that was in the upper LC, they were able to fix the hydraulics and fly it out of there. That was Lou Molinar, Ken, my roommate, and who became my roommate, Bill Parson. And that opened up the LC. We were able to get more infantry in there. After getting more infantry in there, we were able to get our aviators and crew chiefs and door gunner out of there. But we lost our CO, badly wounded, went to Japan, sent home. Captain Watson was killed. Tough time for all of us because we lost our command structure. And we had to start taking more responsibility for what we were doing because we didn't have that leadership. And it really taught me a lesson because those guys on the ground took care of us and our crews. And we made sure that we always took care of the guys on the ground. That's the infantry and the artillery and anybody in fire bases, support bases. That was our focus because we knew if something happened to us, we're going to rely on them to watch over us, and vice versa. They look to us to watch over them. Well, the second day of that whole combat assault, I was flying support missions in that area, and I was asked to go into a landing zone that they just made to take out a whole load of ammunition. And there was mortars and machine guns and you name it. They were loading all this confiscated NVA in the back of my aircraft. And when I came out of that LC and turned around, because I could only go in those first, and I had to back out and turn around. As I turned around and started flying, we took machine gun fire from the front of the aircraft to the back of the aircraft. My crew chief got shot in the leg. He's yelling, he's been hit. I had trying to fly, but I had what I thought was a bunch of sand bounce up into my eyes. I was trying to clear my eyes and looking, what hit me in the face. I wasn't bleeding, but at the same time, I had a bunch of crap in my face and I was trying to evade, dodge from getting shot at. They were shooting RPGs at us, according to my crew chief, and landed on, I'm trying to think, where could I land? Because we were leaking fuel real bad. You could actually see the fuel gauge going down. I said, well, we got to get on the ground. And I remember we just opened up fire support base Birch's Garden on the edge of the Ashaw Valley. So I proceeded to fly to that fire support base that was only 3 to 5 miles away, landed on the artillery pad there and started counting the bullet holes. And when I got out of the aircraft, my crew chief said, sir, look at this. We had a sliding bullet protection built into our seats. Right on the left side, I sat in the left seat as aircraft commander. And right in the middle of that was a bullet. And what happened when it hit that fiberglass, the bullet is it was the fiberglass that hit me in the face. So, not sand. That's how close I was to getting shot and possibly killed. So that was my first experience of getting shot down. My reward for that was having my aircraft have to get fixed and maintenance. And I got to spend 3 days on Birch's Garden as the liaison officer on the same artillery pad that I landed at, where the artillery guys would give me boxes that I filled with dirt, and myself and a radio operator and a clerk proceeded to build a bunker. After a couple of nights of observing people trying to come through the wire, and the first sergeant for that unit fighting hand-to-hand combat right outside my bunker, I assure you, I was on the radio trying to remind my company operations that I was an aviator and I was not an infantry person, and I hadn't been trained for this kind of thing. So eventually I was replaced, and the next day, by an infantry officer pilot who had gotten himself in a little bit of trouble. So they decided they would use this as a way of disciplining him. So I was replaced, and I came back, and my aircraft by then was fixed, and I got to start flying again. So from that, and then the following month, by the way, we received as did all the units that participated in that, a valorous unit citation for airborne. 25th of April through I think it was the 13th of May. But on the 10th of May, we started Hamburger Hill. We did the insert along with the 101st Aviation Battalion, had 60 aircraft. We inserted a couple of battalions onto Hamburger Hill. We inserted the 3rd of the 187th. The 3rd of the 187th was also the unit that was airborne. On the 13th of May, they were overrun on airborne, and I believe it was 13 artillery people were killed in action. But we did Hamburger Hill up until Hamburger Hill was taken. I did resupply missions during that operation, and I also sling loaded off bodies of NVA soldiers killed, and they were buried at down at Blaze in a big pit. Took off numerous loads of bodies. Next few months was just a lot of flying, about 100 hours a month. I'd get to the point where I'd have too many hours in a 30-day period and get grounded, but went on R&R in September. In August, I spent a month up at Quang Tri flying for the 5th Mech. Marines, and any unit was up in the Quang Tri area because they moved the Marine aviation out of Quang Tri and down to Da Nang. So they needed additional helicopter support. So I spent August up in Quang Tri getting familiar with the fire bases up there, like Rockpile and Fuller and Dong Ha and all those, Quezon. Again, in November, I went up to Quang Tri because now it was my company's turn. We alternated this between A, B, and C company every month. So August, and then again in November. And I happened to be there in November when a call came in saying, would somebody volunteer to go up and land at Fuller and take some wounded off the fire base? The medevacs had been trying and attempting to land from above the cloud there. Got to tell you, it was rainy day, bad monsoon kind of weather in November, low ceilings. Well, I volunteered. I said, yeah, I'll go do it. See if I can come up. So I called them on the radio, got their frequency, and said, call up Ghost Rider 678, Spiderman. I'm going to attempt to come up, get your people wounded, but I'm going to need some help. So I told him I needed somebody with an FM radio to stand on the side of the fire base. It's up on a pinnacle, high pinnacle. on all sides, 3 sides basically, except for the one that was running out to the west. It was kind of a finger out there. That was where they were getting attacked from, as I understand it. And Lieutenant Booty was who I was talking to, and he agreed to call me on the radio and talk to me on the radio. We have a instrument in the Huey that homes in on FM radio signal. So if the needle swings to the right, it means that the signal is coming from the right. So if you wanted to fly to a radio signal, you would move to the right, and when it swung to the left, it moved over to the left. So if you kept the needle centered, you were centered on that frequency, and you could kind of fly to it. But I came up low, had to fly low level for rainy, cloudy, nasty weather. Ceiling was about 500 feet. Fuller sat at about 1,000 feet. So the only way for me to come up there was to hover up to on the side of the steep cliffs that Fuller sat on. I had about 40 feet of visibility. My rotor stuck out about 15 to 20 feet in front of the aircraft. So as long as I could see the side of that hillside, the mountain, I could kind of make sure I didn't have any contact with trees or anything else. I could hover up the side of that mountain. So I started hovering up, and the Lieutenant Booty would say, I could hear you, you're to my left, you're to my right, which I knew, and then I'd adjust, and I was trying to fly to the signal I was seeing and the corrections he was giving to me. He warned me that they'd been taking sniper fire and they'd taken a lot of rounds, and I figured once I got in the clouds, they couldn't see me. So I felt somewhat safe. Oh, I hover up the mountain, and I came up and actually popped up above the fire base so fast it kind of surprised me, and I almost went IFR into the clouds. I had to push down on the collective and get myself lower pretty quick. And we weren't over the pad, so I had him walk me to the pad. So he's kind of walking over to the pad where he wanted me to land so they could load the wounded. And I'm hovering over the top of them. We finally get to the pad. They load the wounded on. And I asked them, where's the steepest part off this base? And he said to the northwest, which was towards the DMZ. They were right on the DMZ. And I knew the terrain somewhat, and I agreed with him. So when I took off, I just picked up to a hover and flew forward under IFR conditions, because now I was on instruments. And then after I knew I cleared the side of the mountain, I started descending through the clouds, and then I broke out at about 500 feet. They said they were up there on the mountain listening to me, hoping they didn't hear a crash. And when they finally couldn't hear me anymore, they figured I must be okay. Well, I went out to the hospital ship because he had a lieutenant, their executive officer, had a head wound. Mike Ferguson is his name. And we get out there. Like I said, dark, rainy night, winds blowing. And I look at the ship, and it's rising and falling in about 30 foot, maybe 20, 30 foot seas. And it's rocking and rolling up and down same time. And I'm thinking, oh, this will be interesting, trying to land a Huey, which has hard skids, no wheels, on pneumatic shock absorbers. You have to time it just right. So as I first approach, I get over the ship, I'm trying to judge it, and then I realize, oh no, this is ship still coming up. So I pulled back real quick, let the ship rise up higher. It goes down. So I watched it a couple of times, and I decided to do another attempt. Well, this time I timed it perfect, right at the top of the crest. Got the skids on the deck, and I bottomed my collective, and I swear we're going down so fast that I kept checking. I thought we were still flying. Well, it turns out that's how fast the ship was sinking. We got the wounded off. We took Lieutenant Ferguson off, I think one other person. Then they told me to take one of them to Quang Tri, to the hospital at Quang Tri. He didn't need to be on the ship. So I'm thinking, well, I say to my co-pilot, watch this, we're gonna have some fun. So as the ship came up real fast, I pulled collective, grabbed an armful of lift that way, and we shot off that ship so fast it was funny. And then I flew to Quang Tri and got the other wounded to the hospital, and I went back to my hut that I lived in, an old Marines hut, Quang Tri. We were doing a little bit of support for the 3rd Marine Division, mostly recon work. Special Forces, CCN, 5th Mech. I'm sure I've resupplied the Arty boys up there in the Fuller at least once or twice before this all occurred. Thought nothing of it. I was mostly telling my buddies about landing and taking off from that hospital ship. And later on in December, I ended up doing the same thing of trying to get a hot meal and dry pair of socks to everybody that was out enlisting posts in the field around Camp Evans. We were hovering in the clouds, the same kind of thing, getting in IFR conditions and having to get a ground control approach back into the Camp Evans. But we got meals to all but I think one site. We just never could find them. But that's the kind of flying we were doing. Every other day was a combat assault. And then when you didn't do combat assault, you did resupply. And I think I was a perfect Huey pilot because I was kind of a people person. I would have liked to have flown guns, but I was most interested in, getting letters and food to the guys on the ground and taking them out of the field and on their last day, and know you're flying them home and they're going to go home on an airplane. Army aviation has a term, it's called above the best. What I learned is the best are the guys on the ground. And my job was to support them. That's what I was trained to do. And if that meant food, if it meant emergency medical evacuation, that was our job. Had to take the KIAs out, bring them back to grave registration. I flew, whatever the mission was. That's what I was trained to be, a helicopter pilot to support the guys on the ground. And these guys in artillery were every bit as important to me as the infantry, because they were the ones that gave us the artillery support on every combat assault we did to make sure that as few enemy were around that LZ as possible. I'm sure it saved my life because they weren't as anxious or running around to shoot at us when we would go in. I didn't fly. Every time I took off, aircraft commander checked artillery to see where they're flying, where are they firing, where's the fire missions, because you didn't want to get between the artillery people and where they were landing. That could ruin your day. But we always talked to the artillery, and the guys on Fuller, they were my guys. They were the guys on the ground that I was there to support. My job was to support them. They were the heroes. They always say that I was their hero. I was doing my job. I was doing my job to support them. And so I've come to have a lot of friends in the 6th of the 33rd Artillery. They're finding me and wanting to ask me when they finally found me. They said, "Did you get the Silver Star we put you in for?" I laughed. I said, "No, I never got anything." And they were shocked. And Bob and Lieutenant Booty and they decided they're going to get me my medal, by God. And they tried writing it up, and trying to get me a medal through Congress. But I know that it's all but impossible to get a medal after 2 years after action. Department of the Army has to prove it. Their recognition of me was more than enough. And I haven't seen, and I don't think I'll ever see, but I don't need it. I've got these guys that appreciate what I did for them just as much as I appreciate what they did for me. And that was what I hold the most coming out of Vietnam, is knowing I did my job and I did it well. My life after Vietnam is got married 7 days after I got home, had a boy and a girl, got 6 grandkids, worked at Pacific Telephone, Pacific Bell SBC for 27, almost 28 years. Started off as a non-management person, and I retired as executive. I went back to school and got my degrees. Had a good life. My wife died after 38 years. 4 years later, I met my now wife, and guess how I did it? I met her in Spain when I was there to visit my buddy Lou Molinar, who had moved over to Spain, and his fiance was from Oklahoma. She invited her best friend, and that's how I met my wife. So it was Lou Molinar. In fact, let me show you something real quick. Here's a picture. Lou and I, here's when he was wounded and on the hospital ship, and I came out to see him when he was getting ready to leave that hospital ship. And here we are at my wedding, and he married us. So that's the kind of friendships you form in the Army when you've been through Vietnam together. Now my days are filled with golf, family, travel. I have a good life. Like many, I got some post-traumatic stress disorder issues and hearing loss. Thanks to the hearing aids, that's been improved. So I frequently go to the VA and get those kinds of things taken care of. But other than that, I can't complain. And I continue to meet with my friends and go to reunions and that kind of thing. Thank you very much. Thank you, 6th of the 33rd Artillery. You're my Artie boys.
And now, a recommendation for the award of the Distinguished Flying Cross to Eugene E. Franck, CWO2A Company, 158th AHB, Camp Evans, South Vietnam. From First Lieutenant Dennis L. Booty. I highly recommend CWO2 Eugene Franck for the award of the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions above and beyond the call of duty. CWO2 Franck's heroic actions while under enemy fire directly led to the medevac of severely wounded U.S. Army personnel on 18th November 1969. I was the senior FDO of C Battery 6th and 33rd Artillery, USARV. Our firebase, Firebase Fuller, sat atop Dong Ha Mountain, just south of the DMZ in I Corps. The top half of our mountain had been covered with clouds for several days due to storms. On the evening of November 17, 1969, our unit started receiving incoming mortar, RPG, and rifle rounds. As the only officer in our battery with field experience adjusting close combat artillery fire, I went out on the perimeter with a PRC-25 radio to adjust incoming fire. After the attack was over, I went back to the FDC to file our sitrep and discovered we had wounded personnel. One of our men, Lieutenant Michael Ferguson, RXO, had received a wound that had opened up his skull and exposed his brain. I made an immediate request for medevac. After 3 attempts by medevac units failed due to the cloud cover, I made an urgent plea for anyone who would come pick up our wounded. My plea was answered by CWO2 Eugene Franck, or Spiderman, of the Ghost Riders, 158th Airborne. Franck was the aircraft commander of the UH-1H Huey aircraft with A Company 158th Airborne Ghost Riders. His unit was one of the transportation units that brought us supplies, and I was impressed with his bravery in that he would risk attempting a landing under such conditions when others, who were previously tasked with that mission, had refused to do so. Franck told me that he would require my help to guide him to the landing pad. His plan was to fly over the side of the hill, then hover up the hillside by homing into my PRC-25 radio signal and my verbal instructions. I stood on the edge of the hill as he approached. I could barely hear his blades due to the clouds. As he got near to our hill, he was clearly exposed to enemy fire. I coached him up the hill with commands such as, "You are directly west and below me. Come up and over." After more than a dozen such transmissions, I told him he was directly above the landing pad. While the wounded were being loaded, he calmly asked me for the best heading off the landing pad for his departure, as he would be dropping off the side of the hill blindly until he punched through the bottom of the clouds and could fly visually again. Word was sent to our BNHQ that our men had been taken by Franck to the hospital ship Repose, and that a very difficult landing due to the storm-induced 12 to 15-foot ocean swell had been made directly attributable to the competence of Franck's skill flying his helicopter. Due to the expertise and composure of Franck, Lieutenant Michael Ferguson's life-threatening severe head wound received the care required to save his life. Much of his restored condition today can be directly attributed to the brave, heroic, and timely actions of Franck.